Before we go a single step further, I want to be honest with you about what this is. Some of what you are about to hear is documented sitting in archives and geology surveys and museum basements right now. Some of it is a theory, a big one. And the whole reason this story pulls people in is that the line between those two things is a lot blurrier than anyone in charge would like you to believe. So here is the claim we are going to test tonight, that in the years after 1888, one of the richest families in human history quietly moved to buy up mining claims on a remote island in the middle of Lake Superior, not to mine it, to close it, to seal something in the rock that did not fit the story America was telling about itself, and that the evidence of who really built the oldest mines on that island got buried under 140 years of copper stock, national park brochures, and polite silence. You can walk away from this thinking it is nonsense. That is fine. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. But by the end, I want you to at least understand why the question refuses to die, because it starts with a hole in the ground that nobody can explain. There is an island called Isle Royale. It sits in the northwest corner of Lake Superior, closer to Canada than to the American mainland it technically belongs to. It is 45 miles long, cold, forested, and for most of the year almost completely empty of people. Today it is a national park. In winter the ferries stop. The wolves and the moose have the place to themselves. It is, by design, one of the most isolated pieces of land in the United States. And it is covered in ancient mine pits. Not one, not a dozen, thousands of them. Depressions cut into the bedrock, some shallow, some dropping 20 or 30 feet straight down. They run in lines along the copper veins for miles. When the first modern surveyors came through in the 1840s, they assumed at first they were natural. They were not. Somebody dug these. Somebody who knew exactly where the copper was followed it through solid rock and pulled it out. Here is the part that is not theory. This is in the record. When 19th century prospectors wanted to find the best copper on Isle Royale, they did not survey the ground themselves. They looked for the old pits. The ancient miners had already found every rich vein on the island, and the modern companies simply dug where the old ones had dug. Think about what that means for a second. The men with steam engines and dynamite and geological training could not do better than whoever came before them with, supposedly, stone tools. Because that is the official answer. Stone tools. The pits were the work of indigenous peoples, part of what archaeologists call the old copper complex. And the mining goes back an astonishing distance. 4,000 years, maybe more. This is real. This is not the theory. Native peoples of the Great Lakes were working copper on Isle Royale and the nearby Keweenaw Peninsula for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot in the region. That fact alone should be famous, and somehow it is not. The method, as reconstructed by mainstream archaeology, was brutal and slow. You heat the rock with fire, then you throw cold water on it so it cracks. Then you beat it for hours, for days, with rounded hammerstones, chunks of hard rock, held in the bare hand, or lashed to a handle. Thousands of these hammerstones have been found on the island, many shattered from use, discarded in heaps beside the pits. Slowly, agonizingly, you free the copper from the surrounding stone. And the copper on Isle Royale is not like copper anywhere else. In most of the world, copper comes locked inside ore, chemically bound up, and you need to smelt it to get the metal out. On Isle Royale and the Keweenaw, it comes out native, pure, sometimes in flakes, sometimes in fist-sized nuggets, and sometimes in masses that stagger belief. Slabs of solid metallic copper weighing hundreds of pounds, in some cases, tons. There is a documented piece the modern miners hit that weighed over 5,000 pounds. Pure copper, sitting in the rock and around it, the marks of the ancient miners who had found it first and worked at its edges long before. They could not move it. It was too big, so they had chipped away what they could reach and left the rest. When the modern crews found masses like this, they found them ringed by old stone hammers and charcoal from fires set thousands of years earlier. Now here is the first real crack in the tidy story, and I want to be careful, because this is where fact starts sliding toward question. Nobody knows how much copper came out of these mines. Estimates over the years have run wildly, from modest figures up to guesses of hundreds of millions of pounds removed across the millennia. The honest answer is that we cannot count what was carried away thousands of years ago. But the pits are real, the scale is real, and it prompts an obvious question that has no clean answer. Where did all of it go? Because here is the strange thing. The people who supposedly did all this mining did not, as far as the standard account goes, use copper for heavy tools or weapons or industry on any large scale. They made ornaments, beads, small blades, fish hooks, trade goods, beautiful but light. And copper from the Lake Superior region has been found in ancient burial mounds hundreds and even thousands of miles away, traded across a continent through the Hopewell networks and older systems still. Let me sit on this a little longer, because it is genuinely one of the strangest facts in North American archaeology, and almost nobody knows it. Copper objects made from Lake Superior metal have turned up in ancient burial mounds in Ohio, in the Mississippi Valley, along the Gulf Coast, deep in the American Southeast. Chemically, you can trace it. The distinctive purity of the Lake Superior deposits leaves a fingerprint, so we know, for certain, that metal pulled out of these northern pits was moving across the whole eastern half of the continent thousands of years ago, hand to hand, culture to culture, along trade routes that ran for well over 1,000 miles. That is an incredible achievement, and it is real, and it should be taught in every school. But notice what it also does. It gives the official story an escape hatch for the volume problem. However much copper you think came off that island, the answer to where it went is always, it was traded away, it is scattered across a continent in graves and hoards we have mostly never found. It is an answer that can absorb almost any number, because you can never fully check it. And that is exactly the kind of answer that makes a certain type of person lean forward instead of relaxing. Because an explanation that can account for any amount of missing material by pointing at material you cannot inventory is not really a measurement. It is a story that happens to be unfalsifiable. It might be completely true, and most likely it largely is, but it leaves just enough room in the dark for a second story to live. So the mainstream story does hold together, mostly. Ancient peoples mined enormous amounts of copper over 4,000 years and traded it across North America. That is the answer you will get from any archaeologist, and there is real evidence for it. There is one more real detail I have to give you, because the theory leans on it hard. At some point the ancient mining stopped. The old copper complex, the period when these Great Lakes peoples were most intensely working the metal, wound down, and in the centuries before European contact, large-scale copper mining on Isle Royale simply was not happening anymore. The pits went quiet, the forest crept back over them. By the time French explorers heard rumours of the copper islands of Lake Superior, the great age of the mines was already ancient history to the people living nearby. Mainstream archaeology has reasonable explanations for why the mining tapered off, shifts in culture, in trade, in what people valued. But to the theorist, a vast mining operation that runs for thousands of years and then goes silent, leaving behind more removed rock than the official users seem to have needed, is not a culture-losing interest. It is a project that ended, and projects end when whoever was running them leaves or falls or is made to stop. But there has always been a stubborn minority who look at that island and say, the numbers do not sit right. That the sheer volume of rock moved, the depth of some of the workings, the precision of following veins through hard stone, all of it seems out of proportion to a scatter of beads and trade trinkets. And they ask a different question. What if the official builders are not the whole story? What if somebody at some point ran an operation here that was bigger, older, or more organized than we have been allowed to say? This is where our theory is born. And this is where the year 1888 walks onto the stage. By the late 1800s, the copper country of Lake Superior was one of the industrial engines of the United States. The Quinault Peninsula was producing staggering wealth. Whole towns rose out of the wilderness. Fortunes were made in Boston and New York on the backs of miners 1,000 miles away. Copper was not a curiosity anymore. It was the metal that electricity ran on, the metal the modern world was being wired with, and whoever controlled it controlled a piece of the future. Isle Royale had been mined in fits and starts for decades by this point, with companies rushing in, going broke, and pulling out. The island was rich but cruel. The isolation, the weather, the cost of shipping everything across open water, it broke most of the ventures that tried. But the copper was there. Everyone knew the copper was there. The ancient pits proved it. You have to understand the rhythm of the place to feel how strange the ending is. There were real booms on Isle Royale. In the 1840s, and again in the 1870s, and once more toward the end of the century, waves of speculators and companies poured onto the island, sank shafts, built docks and stamp mills, and little town sites in the wilderness, and swore this time the fortune was real. And the copper genuinely was there. Crews pulled out solid metal. Investors saw samples that would make anyone's eyes go wide. Then it would collapse. The cost of hauling supplies across open lake, the short ice-free season, the sheer effort of working ground that fought you at every turn, all of it drained the money faster than the copper could replace it. Company after company folded. The little towns emptied. The docks rotted. And the claims those companies had held, the legal rights to dig on specific pieces of the island, floated free again, cheap, available, waiting for the next dreamer with capital. That is the ordinary tragedy of Isle Royale, and every mining region has some version of it. But it also created the exact conditions the theory in your title needs. An island full of proven copper, a graveyard of failed ventures, and a pile of cheap orphaned claims that a patient buyer could sweep up quietly, if a patient buyer ever had a reason to want them all. In 1888, according to the theory, someone did. The claim at the heart of tonight is that in 1888, something was found on Isle Royale that was not supposed to exist. And here I have to be straight with you again. There is no headline in the paper of record that says, "Workers on Isle Royale unearthed a lost civilization." What we have instead are fragments, later accounts, and a pattern of behavior that the theory says is the real evidence. So treat what follows as the case being argued, not a verdict. The story goes like this. A crew working a deep section of an old pit, one of the ancient ones, broke through into something that did not match. Not a natural cavity. Not the rough work of hammerstones and fire. Something worked, something finished. Cut stone where cut stone had no business being. Surfaces too regular, too deliberate, as if the ancient pit they were remining had itself been dug through something older still. Picture the moment the way the theory tells it. A handful of men, deep underground on a freezing island, working by lamplight in a shaft that follows a vein the ancients opened thousands of years before them. They are not looking for wonders, they are looking for copper, because copper is a paycheck and the season is short and the company is already bleeding money. They swing, they clear rubble, they push the old pit deeper. And then a tool goes through into open space that should not be there. What is on the other side in the story is not a cave. It is a face of stone that was cut, straight edges, angles that nature does not make, a worked surface running back into the dark beyond the reach of the lamp. And around the men suddenly the sense that the ancient miners they had been quietly admiring for finding all this copper were not the beginning of the story either. That the pit they had been remining was itself dug into the ruin of something the bead makers and the fishermen had also found, and also could not explain. Now, stop. Because right here is where I have to hold your hand and tell you the truth, before your imagination runs off with the rest of this. There is no artifact from that shaft in any museum. There is no photograph of a cut wall from the bottom of an Isle Royale pit. What I just described to you is the scene as the theory needs it to have happened, reconstructed from later retellings and the general Tartaria template, not from a preserved, documented find. Hold both things in your head at once. The pits are real and staggering. This particular chamber is a claim resting on thin air. Keep walking with me anyway, because what happens next in the story is the part that actually leaves a trail. Because whatever was or was not found in that shaft, something changed after 1888. The pattern of who owned the island changed, and that pattern is the closest thing this whole theory has to a fingerprint. In the Tartaria framework, which is the lens a lot of people bring to this island, that is the whole thesis in miniature. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The idea, and I want to name it plainly as a fringe theory and not established history, is that there was once an advanced globe-spanning civilization whose works were later claimed by others, buried, drowned, or written out of the record during the 19th century. Its believers point at architecture, at old world's fairs, at mysterious mounds and earthworks, and they say, someone erased a chapter of human history and we are living in the edited version. Isle Royale, to that way of thinking, is close to a perfect candidate. Remote. Rich in the one metal an advanced society would need above almost any other, covered in workings so old and so extensive that even mainstream science struggles to fully explain them. And crucially, it is a place that got locked up, sealed off, turned into a park where you cannot dig, cannot prospect, cannot go poking into the old pits looking for whatever might still be down there. So who did the locking? Follow the money, the theory says. And the money leads to one of the most powerful families that has ever lived. The Rockefellers. Now let us be fair about the documented record because it matters. The Rockefeller name is bound up with Standard Oil, the greatest industrial monopoly in American history. But the family and the men around it were not content with oil. In 1899, William Rockefeller, John Dee's brother, together with associates from the Standard Oil world, helped create the Amalgamated Copper Company. It was an attempt to do to copper what Standard Oil had done to oil. Corner it, control it. Consolidate the mines, the smelters, the prices, all of it under one quiet, ruthless umbrella. This is real. This is in the history books. The Standard Oil crowd made a hard, deliberate move into copper right at the turn of the century. And Amalgamated was not a gentle enterprise. The way it was assembled has become a case study in how the Standard Oil men operated. They used a bank, a holding company, and a web of paper to buy control of huge mining interests in Montana with money that traced back to Standard Oil fortunes, then floated the whole thing on the stock market at inflated value and left ordinary investors holding the losses when the scheme wobbled. It was quiet where it needed to be quiet and brutal where it needed to be brutal. It moved through intermediaries. It hid the size of its ambitions until the pieces were already in place. This is the documented character of the men we are talking about, patient accumulators who understood that the real power move is to control the thing before anyone realizes it is worth controlling. The theory takes that documented fact and asks a pointed question. What if the copper play started earlier than 1899 and quieter? What if a decade before Amalgamated made headlines, the same interests were already moving on the richest and strangest copper ground in the country, the ground with the inconvenient old workings on it, and doing it in a way designed to attract no attention at all? There is a certain logic to it, even if you refuse to believe a word. If you were one of the wealthiest men alive, and you got word that copper country held something that could not be explained, something that raised uncomfortable questions about the age and origin of the metal your whole future empire depended on, what would you actually do? You would not hold a press conference. You would not send in scientists. You would do the one thing your entire career had trained you to do. You would buy the ground, quietly, through other people's names, and then you would make sure nothing ever came out of it again. Here is how the buying is supposed to have worked, and this is the core of the accusation in your title. After 1888, agents acting for Rockefeller, Connected Capital, moved through the tangle of failed and struggling Isle Royale mining companies and began acquiring claims. Not aggressively, not in a way that made the papers. They bought quietly, through intermediaries, picking up the rights to parcels that other men had already given up on. The island was littered with busted ventures. Claims were cheap. A patient buyer with deep pockets could assemble control of enormous stretches of it without anyone stitching the pattern together. And the tell, the theory says, is what they did with the claims once they had them, which was nothing. They did not mine them out, they did not develop them, they sat on them. Land and mineral rights on one of the copper richest islands on earth, held and left idle, as if the point was never to extract the copper at all, as if the point was to make sure nobody else could dig where they did not want digging done. That is the shape of the argument: quiet acquisition, followed by deliberate stillness. To a believer, that is not failed business. That is a burial. I promised you friction, and honesty means giving it to you, so here is the case against all of this. And it is not weak. There is a much simpler explanation for why claims on Isle Royale got bought up cheap and then sat idle. The island was a money pit. Company after company had already proven that you could go broke mining there no matter how much copper was in the ground, because the cost of operating in that isolation ate every profit. A wealthy investor buying distressed claims and then not developing them is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is ordinary speculation. You buy low, you hold, you wait for conditions or prices to change, and often they never do, and the land just sits. That happened all over the American mining West. Nothing sinister required. As for the cutstone, the finished surfaces, the broken through chamber, there is no verified documented artifact from Isle Royale in any museum that proves a lost advanced civilization. The pits are real, the hammerstones are real, the tonnage debate is real. But the specific 18th yacht discovery at the centre of this theory rests on later retellings, not on a preserved object you can go look at behind glass. And the mainstream account, ancient indigenous miners working copper over 4,000 years and trading it across a continent, is supported by hammerstones, by charcoal dating, by the copper artifacts found in mounds far away. It is a real answer, and it is a good one. So a reasonable person can hear this entire story and conclude calmly that there is a mundane version where everything checks out. Ancient peoples mined the island. Their descendants and the archaeological record account for the copper. Modern companies failed there because the place was brutal. A rich man bought cheap failed claims and left them idle because that is what rich men do with cheap failed claims. And Isle Royale became a national park in 1940 for the same reason lots of wild places did, because it was beautiful and worth protecting, not because something was hidden under it. That is the skeptic's version, and I am not going to pretend it away. But here is why the other version will not die, and I think this is the real heart of it, whatever you end up believing. Every part of this story sits on top of a genuine mystery that the official account only partly closes. The pits really are staggering. Modern miners really did just follow the ancient workings because the ancient miners had already found everything. The masses of pure copper really are extraordinary, the kind of thing that in any other context we would call a wonder of the world. The debate over how much was actually removed really is unsettled, and the wealthiest industrial interests in the country really did make a hard, secretive move to control copper right in this window of history. None of that is invented. The theory does not need to lie about the raw material. It only has to connect the real dots in a darker order than the textbooks do. And there is something about the ending that the conspiracy version explains a little too well. Isle Royale, alone among the great copper grounds of Lake Superior, got taken off the board completely. The Koh-i-Noor kept mining for decades. But the island, the one with the oldest and strangest workings, the one where the pits went deepest and the questions ran hottest, that one got quietly frozen. First bought up and left idle. Then, in time, turned into protected federal land where prospecting is forbidden, and the old pits sit under moss and forest, undisturbed, unexcavated, and legally off limits to the kind of digging that might actually answer the question once and for all. And here is the documented bookend. In 1940, Isle Royale officially became a national park. The federal government took the whole island, drew a line around it, and placed it under the kind of protection that makes prospecting and mining and digging permanently illegal. Whatever private claims still existed were absorbed or extinguished in the process. From that year forward, there would be no more shafts, no more crews, no more breaking through into anything at the bottom of an old pit. The ground was closed by law, and it has stayed closed ever since. On its face, that is a good and ordinary thing. Isle Royale is genuinely stunning and genuinely worth protecting, and that explanation needs no conspiracy at all. But look at the sequence the theory lays out, all in a row. A strange discovery no one will confirm. A quiet sweep of the claims by interests tied to the coldest money in the country. Decades of deliberate stillness on ground that should have been worked. And then, finally, the state itself steps in and wraps the whole island in a permanent legal seal that guarantees no one will ever dig there again. Each step has an innocent explanation. It is the order and the completeness of them that makes people uneasy. You could call that preservation. A believer calls it a lid. Think about the position that leaves us in. The one place best suited to test the wildest claims about who really mined the ancient Great Lakes copper is also the one place where you are not allowed to test them. The evidence, whatever it is, sits exactly where it has always sat, in the rock of Isle Royale, and the door is closed. Not violently, not with guards and fences, with something far more durable than that, with a park sign and a law and 100 years of everyone agreeing there is nothing to see. That is the genius of the burial in your title, if the burial is real. You do not have to destroy the evidence. You do not have to blow up the chamber or melt down the artifact. You just have to buy the ground, make sure nobody works it, wait for the world to lose interest, and then let the state wrap the whole thing in the gentle, permanent silence of a nature reserve. No shovels, no cameras, no questions that anyone in power ever has to answer. And the family that, on the documented record, moved to corner copper at exactly this moment in history, using intermediaries and quiet money and the patience that comes with generational wealth, is the family whose name ended up attached to the theory. Not because there is a signed confession in a vault, there is not, but because the method the theory describes, quiet acquisition, deliberate stillness, and a lid that looks like a gift to the public, is precisely the method those men were famous for using everywhere else they went. So where does that leave you and me standing at the edge of this? I cannot show you the chamber, I cannot hand you the artifact from 1888 and say, here, this is the proof, the story is true. If I did, I would be lying to you, and the whole point of walking through this carefully is that I would rather you trust the real parts than swallow a fake one. The chamber is a claim. The lost civilization is a fringe theory. The specific Rockefeller purchase of every last claim to bury a secret is an accusation without a paper confession behind it. But the pits are real. The vanished copper is real. The industrial titans reaching for control of that copper are real. And the island sealed away from the kind of investigation that might settle it. That is as real as the ground under your feet. Maybe it is all coincidence stacked so high it starts to look like design. Maybe ancient peoples simply mined an astonishing amount of metal, and a rich man bought some worthless land, and a beautiful island became a park, and there is no thread connecting any of it except our hunger to find one. Or maybe, out there in the cold, 45 miles of Lake Superior from the nearest highway, under the moss and the fallen trees and the law that says you cannot dig, there is a hole in the rock that someone made sure you would never be allowed to climb down into. A hole that goes deeper than 4,000 years, a hole with worked stone at the bottom of it that does not belong to any history you were taught. The copper came out of that island for longer than any civilization we can name has existed. Somebody found it first. Somebody worked it with a skill that embarrassed the machines that came later. And somebody, if the theory is right, decided the safest thing to do with the answer was to own the ground it was buried in, and then to leave that ground alone forever. We are told the story ends with a park, wolves and moose and quiet water, a place preserved for its beauty, nothing more. But the oldest mines on the continent are still down there, still sealed, still waiting. And the only people who could have told us what was really found in 1888 made their fortunes on a single principle: one they never once broke. The most valuable thing in the world is the thing nobody else is allowed to touch.